Thank you very much. I'd like to really thank the organizers for putting this together, and it's a very exciting workshop. I'm going to talk about similar topics as Susanna did in the morning, giving a nice frame to the day. So it's this whole perceptual precision problem. So the idea is this. I'm going to paint you this little picture. There's not going to be a lot of actual images here, but so it's the middle of the night. You're jet lagged, and you wake up in your hotel room. It's pitch dark, and there's an armchair in your hotel room. And as it gets lighter, because it's dawn, your perceptual state changes. Oh, I guess look at that. So first, I just don't see the armchair's color at all, and then I see it as reddish, and then it as red, and then as bright red, and then scarlet, and then as a specific shade of scarlet. The question is what changed? So that was Susanna's question, and this is also what I'd like to engage with. I'm going to give a different answer from the one that Susanna was exploring. And I'm also going to talk about kind of more big picture implications of that, about the differences between perception and belief. So how can you describe this change? And the one way in which you can go, and that's studied by John Morrison, and then Dr. Jesse Munton and Rachel Benson were also writing really important papers about it, is that what changes is your perceptual confidence. So your perceptual confidence in the armchair's being of a certain shape gets higher. So the idea is that beliefs can be probabilistic or non-probabilistic, and then the same is true for perception. So what's happening here is that one way of describing this armchair example that we started out with is that when I wake up in the middle of the night and it's dark, then I have a very low, then I attribute a very low probability to the proposition that the armchair is scarlet, and then as it gets brighter, I attribute higher and higher probability. So, and the general picture that people who endorse this kind of perceptual confidence picture work with is one where the perceptual state is really depends on these two things: the propositional content, which they invariably take to be propositional content, and a probability distribution. So this is a graph from Morrison's article. So this is the way the content of the perceptual state should be cashed out. So there's the various propositional contents, like that this is actually it's different examples about distance. Each of them is assigned a certain probability. So why would we think this? So Morrison gives two reasons. One of them is phenomenological, the other is epistemic. The phenomenological is that, well, it just seems to us that that's the way it is. I'm going to talk about this a little bit, but much less, because his main reason seems to be epistemic. And that's something that Susanna talked about a fair amount. So the idea is that perceptual states, they justify beliefs, and if given that beliefs are probabilistic, then we have two options. One of them is that the perceptual states are also probabilistic, so that makes justification to be much more straightforward. The other one is not probabilistic, then the justification is going to be a little more complicated. So I don't have to go through that. Susanna did that already. So I should point out, though, that people who work in this kind of framework, so that's true for Morrison and Jesse Munton, they make two assumptions about these perceptual states. One of them is that they're conscious. And in fact, one of Morrison's reasons for thinking that for his perceptual confidence account is that this is what technology tells us. So that's going to be a little problematic in the light of the evidence that we have that perceptual state can be unconscious. So there needs to be some kind of story about unconscious perceptual states. And the other one is that perceptual content is propositional, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. But the main distinction I want to make here is that So here are the two options. One of them is that you can say that, well, perceptual states, there's nothing probabilistic about them at all. And this is the view that Morrison argues against. Now you could say that, yeah, there's something probabilistic about perceptual states, but the question is what it is. What is it? And then Morrison wants to say that what is probabilistic about this perceptual state is the attitude. And what I want to say is, no, it's not the attitude, it's the content. So, I mean, it's, you know, this is something that we learn, or we teach to undergrads, that, yeah, there's the content and the attitude, and it's simple. It's not that simple, but I'm just gonna want to assume that it's simple, just for presentational purposes. So I want to say that what is really going on in these examples is that perceptual states attribute determinable properties, and then the lighter it gets, the more determinate the properties that you attribute. So I take this to be a content, so the probability is showing up in the content side of things and not in the attitude side of things. Why? Because I think that perceptual content is, and I don't think that to be particularly controversial, is the attribution of properties, perceptual attribution of properties to some sensory individuals. And these properties can be more or less determinable, and it's, we know this from a lot of empirical studies that we can attribute fairly determinate properties in the fovea, but in the periphery, we are in a position to attribute very determinable properties, especially when it comes to color and so on. But let me say a little bit about the distinction between determinable and determinate properties. So that's old and respectable distinction, going back almost 100 years. And the idea is that there are different ways in which a property can be. So determinable determinate properties, they give us a hierarchical ordering of property types. So red is a determinable of scarlet, but red is also determinate of color. So you get this hierarchy, and color would be a determinable. It has a number of determinants: blue, red, yellow, green. And green and red, all this, these have further determinants, so scarlet, crimson, and so on. And these have even further determinants. And just to give you the full picture, there's determinants without any further determinants. If there are any, they're called superdeterminants. And determinables, if there are any, they are going to be superdeterminables are determinable without any further determinables. So one thing that so one important way of cashing out what the determinable-determinant relation is to say that, well, so crimson is one way of being red. Scarlet is another way of being red. There is no such thing as being red without being either crimson or scarlet or one of the determinants. So you can't say that something has a determinable property without having the determinants of that property. On the other hand, it's very much possible to represent a determinable property without representing any of the determinants of that property. And what I want to say is that in the case of in the case of perceptual states, you have plenty of evidence that perceptual states often represent determinable properties without representing any of the determinants of this. Or in mental states in general. So we can have beliefs about something having a certain determinable property without any beliefs about any of the determinants that it has. So if you tell me that your car is red, then I can have a belief about your car being red without having any kind of belief about the specific shade of red that the car has. So it's very much possible to attribute a determinable property without attributing any of the determinants of this property. So just to tell you what I'm doing with this. So we have an excellent answer. Is that it seems a very good thing to be able to explain how perceptual states can represent, in some sense, in a probabilistic way. And as people have tried to argue that we can explain that in terms of the propositionality coming in the attitude side, And I want to say that we don't have to posit any kind of additional things like what Morrison is doing. We already have all the resources of explaining the propositionality of perceptual states. Why? Because we have plenty of evidence that perceptual states attribute determinables. Yeah. So I've already mentioned these findings that it seems like when it comes to peripheral vision, the best our visual system can do is to attribute determinable properties. So just to go back to the color case, if I am staring ahead at Albert and I am somewhat trying to figure out what color of what's the color of the blazer that Julia is wearing, then I really can't. If I move my eyes a little closer, then it's going to become a little more less determinable, more determinate. So the perceptual attribution of determinables is a fairly well documented phenomenon. But also, even if, so it seems like only in the phobia do we have any chance of representing properties that even have a kind of fairly high degree of determinacy. But even in the phobia, if you're not, it very much depends on what kind of properties you're attending to. So if you are looking at this clicker and you're attending to its color, then probably that's going to be a much more determinately represented than its shape when you're not focusing on it, when you're not attending to that. Then you can shift your attention on this so that you're attending to its shape, and then its color is going to be less determined. So yeah, so what I'm trying to say with this is that we have independent reasons, completely independent from the whole perceptual precision, the armchair in the dark, the cat in the fog cases, to think of perceptual states as attributing more or less determinable properties. So we already have that. We need to think about it anyway. So we can just bring it in without positing any kind of extra representations. So let me just talk about a couple of important, perks of this framework of taking the perceptual attribution of determinable properties seriously. And one of them comes from attention that I just mentioned. So here's one thing the attention does. It increases or attempts to increase the determinacy of the attributed property. So the idea is that if you're attending to a property of an object, then what's happening is that you're increasing the determinacy of that property. And if you're withdrawing attention to something, then that property kind of goes back into it. Kind of decreases in its determinacy, it's becoming more determinable. There's a fair amount of empirical reasons for that, starting with cross-correlation experiments. It seems like it's true for both exogenous and endogenous attention. Here's another perk of the framework, and that's to think about blur, which is something that philosopher perception very often do. So, one way of explaining blur is that what happens in blurry vision. So if you take off your glasses, or in case you don't need glasses, put on someone else's glasses, what's happening then is that you're attributing determinable spatial location properties to contours. So this is not the same idea as Michael Tai. Michael Tai has a seemingly similar idea that this is blurry vision just fails to comment, as a failure to comment. That just means that it does not represent the spatial location property. My idea is not that it does not represent, it fails to comment on the spatial location of the contour. It does comment on the spatial location of the contour, but it only attributes a determinable property and not a determinate property to the contour. I'd be happy to talk about this. And one reason why both of these cases matter in a much more big picture way is has to do with intentionalism. So intentionalism is the view that the phenomenal character supervenes on phenomenal character of perceptual state supervenes on content of that perceptual state. And we care about this because we like to somehow naturalize the mind. One way of naturalizing the mind is to naturalize content and then somehow trace back consciousness to content. That was the dream in the 80s. So yeah, but then people are saying that, well, there are counter examples to the supervenience claim. two counterexamples. The first one is about attention. So here is a whiteboard. And maybe I can just explain. Here is this kind of 3x3 grid. That's a famous example. So can you visualize a 3x3 grid? And then you can attend to it in such a way that you're attending to the four squares in the corners and the middle one. You can also attend to it in such a way that you're attending to the other four. It's a little more difficult to do this, right? So people are pointing out as well. It seems like it's the same content, but you're exercising your attention differently. So there's different phenomenology. Here's another example. Just visualize two dots, a red one on the left and a green one on the right. If you're attending to the one on the left, the red one on the left, and you shift your attention to the green one on the right, it seems like it's the same content, but different attention, so you have different phenomenology. So that's a counterexample to intentionalism. So it seems like it does not, that phenomenology, the phenomenal character, does not supervene on perceptual content. So that's bad news for intentionalism. Not if you think of attention the way this account does, in terms of increasing and decreasing determinacy of the properties attended to. Because in that case, the content is not actually going to be the same. The content is going to be different, because when you're attending to the red on the left, that's going to attribute much more determinate properties to it, spatial location, color, and so on, than if you're not attending to it. So it's different content, different phenomenology, so there's no problem for intentionalism. So another reason why people were, there's the other kind of counterexample that people bring in against intentionalism has to do with blur. So here the two contrast cases are this. When you see a sharp contour blurrily, so here is a sharp contour, there's a sharp contour, but you take off your glasses, so you see it blurrily, or else you see a fuzzy contour clearly with your glasses. So it seems like, again, same content, different phenomenology. So that's a counterexample to intentionalism. But again, if you think of blurry vision as not the way I described, so really what it does is that it attributes a determinable property to the determinable spatial location property to the contour, then these experiences can have very different content. One of them will attribute a determinable property to a sharp contour, and the other one is going to attribute a determinate spatial location property to a fuzzy contour. So these are very different content, so we should not be surprised that it's going to have different phenomenology. So these are just so this didn't really have much to do with explanandum, but it's just supposed to demonstrate that this framework, whereby we talk about perceptual states attributing more or less determinable properties, is independently plausible on empirical grounds. It also does a lot of philosophical work for us. So again, how can we describe the armchair case, which is really the same as the cat in a fog case? You can describe it as first, when I wake up in the middle of the night, you look at the armchair, and I attribute a very determinable, highly determinable property, color property, to the armchair. And then the lighter it gets, the more determinate color property I'm attributing. That's it. So, again, it's important to really emphasize that this is a difference on the content side, right? So what changes here is the content. It's not really the attributes that I take towards the content, it's the content. It's the attributed properties that change. The determinacy of the attributed property changes. So, probabilistic states, I agree with Morrison and Monroe and all these people that it is not a yes or no state. It's a probabilistic state, but the probabilistic nature comes in the content side. Okay. One important thing is that while Morrison is really focusing on perceptual experiences, like really conscious perceptual states, what I'm talking about would be equally applicable to conscious and unconscious perceptual states. It's really, and we have plenty of evidence that many of the experiments about that are supposed to show us that there are unconscious perceptual states. They also come. They're going to have content that would be the attributional properties that can be more or less determined. Now, I say here that this does not presuppose that perceptual states are propositional attitudes, and indeed it doesn't. But I want to kind of stay away from this because different people really mean different things by propositional attitudes. If you ask me, I'd be happy to talk about it in what sense it's propositional or not propositional. The only thing I'm assuming about the content of perceptual states is the attribution of property to something. And that's, if you think that it's propositional, that's fine. It's not propositional in the sense that doesn't come with a that clause. All right, so here's a potential objection to this account, and that's something that I get mainly from corresponding to John Morrison, but it's also a little bit in his paper. So what he's saying is this: representing determinables, because what's the determinable? Representing determinables is going to give us a plateau of the determinate properties, and not a bell curve like it should. So I think that's not. It doesn't really. So here is the. So the thing about perceptual precision is when you see the cat in the fog, or when I see the armchair in the dusk, there is a certain kind of probabilities that I attribute to different state of affairs, according to Morrison. Some state of affairs are more probable than others. So so his example is that I see someone coming from in a distance, and first I think that it's my friend Bill, but then I'm not very certain about it. So what he's saying is that there's certain probabilities that are attributed to various states of affairs. Not all of them are the same. And he thinks that if we were to describe this phenomenon in terms of the attribution of determinable properties, then that would imply that all of the determinants of these determinables would have the same probability. So I don't see why this would be at all. I don't think that that's just that's the determinable-determinant distinction. I don't see why the representation of a determinable would imply that I attribute equal probability of all these determinants. But he's right about one thing, namely that in order for this account to be a kind of a fully fleshed out account, I would need to say more about the relation between the representation of the determinables and the representation of the determinants in the perceptual case. So let me just start with a non-perceptual case. So I tell you that my armchair is red, and then you're just gonna have to somehow imagine that armchair on the basis of my belief. You're probably not going to attribute the exact same probability to all the determinants of this determinable red. You're going to find certain shades of red more probable than others, presumably based on your previous encounters with armchairs and what are the kind of possible colors of armchairs. So what you're going to have is some kind of bell curve of distribution of probabilities of different colors, and not a plateau like, oh well, this the same, everything is the same, it has the same probability. But I need to say more about this, and this is where I think things are going to get exciting. So, and here I want to go back to Nelson Goodman, and as explained to the rest of us by John Kulwicki. So there's this concept that Goodman calls vertical articulation, which means that the content is vertically articulated if representing a property entails representing at least some of its determinables. So the idea is that, as I told you, when beliefs, when you have a belief and that attributes a certain property, that does not entail anything about the representation of either its determinants or determinables. Just attributes that property, and that's it. Nothing follows from it. Nothing is entailed by that representation. But Kulviki thinks that that's different for perceptual states. So in the case of perceptual states, he thinks that perceptual states are vertically articulated. So the idea is that if you see something as red, seeing it as red entails seeing it as colored. And seeing it as scarlet entails seeing it as red and seeing it as colored. So there's a really important distinction, according to Kulviki and Goodman, between perceptual states on one hand and belief states on the other. And this distinction is that perceptual states are vertically articulated and beliefs are not. So in the case of perceptual states, when you attribute a property, you thereby also attribute at least some determinables of that property. And in the case of beliefs, that's just not the case. So I say this is vertical upwards, because this is what Goodman and Kulviki are focusing on the question about when you're attributing a property, whether or not you're attributing the determinables of that property kind of further. But what I want to focus on is something that Goodman and Kulviki don't talk about, and that's vertical downwards. So the idea is that if you're attributing a property, a determinable property, and we know that we do that both in beliefs and in perceptual states, when you're attributing a determinable property, whether thereby we also attribute some determinants of that property. And again, in the case of beliefs, we blatantly don't. I can have a belief about something having a determinable property without having any kind of beliefs or any kind of reason to hold any beliefs about which determinant of that determinable property should I attribute. But here is the claim, here's my claim, is that just as perceptual states are vertically articulate upwards, they also vertically articulate downwards. So when I'm attributing a determinable property, let's say a determinable color property red to a certain object, I thereby also am attributing a determinant of that determinable. So we have a nice distinction between belief content and perceptual content in this very abstract level, namely that one content is vertically articulated, I guess, both upwards and downwards, and the belief content is not. So how is it going to help us in clarifying the relation between, the kind of understanding whether the attribution of a determinable entails a bell curve or a plateau? Well, it's going to help us because when let's suppose that you're again, I'm looking at Albert, I'm trying to figure out the color of Julia's blazer. I may only be able to attribute a certain determinable property to that blazer, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to attribute equal probability to all the determinants of that determinable. I have some certain background assumption, and also some, I've encountered blazers before, so I have some kind of background reasons to think of to represent some colors, some determinants of that determinable to be more probable than others. So it can really have a nice bell-shaped distribution. So, right. Okay, and this is where I'm going to try to go very big picture. So here's a question that people are interested in when they talk about perception and belief, namely what's the difference between that content. And there's a very respectable and old approach to this, vaguely associated with Dretke's name, namely, and it's something that people have been talking about today as well, namely, perceptual states have analog content, beliefs are digital content. Perceptual states are imagistic, beliefs are propositional and non-imagistic. So here's Dretke's, and this would be a really important and crucial thing to understand about the mind, right? So how perceptual representation differs from non-perceptual representation, from belief representation. And a old intuition is that one of them is analog and the other one is digital. So here's Dretski's way of trying to catch this up. In the case of perceptual states, when you're representing a property, you thereby also represent another property. In the case of beliefs, it's not the case. So in perceptual states, when you represent I'm going to show you this lid. If you're representing its shape, you're thereby also representing its color, right? When you're representing a state, entails representing its color. That's the Dretski's law. Whereas if you form a belief about the shape of this, that is not in any way entailing the representation of the color. So that's supposed to be the big Dretskian distinction. So, but there are some worries about this solution. So, one probably most famously articulated by Mohan Mathan. Namely, depending on how we individuate perceptual states, you could say that no, it's just not the case. That what's going on here is two different perceptual states. Each of them attribute exactly more properties. It's not the case that there's some kind of logical entailment between the perceptual representation of shape and the perceptual representation of color. They happen to be, or kind of it's in some kind of causal entailment, not logical entailment. So we can't really use this. I mean, nice as it is, this kind of neat and clear-cut as it is, what Dretski was suggesting, that's just not going to work. So what I want to do is to give a weaker, but very kind of structurally similar way of keeping apart perceptual kind of belief and that is in some ways quite similar to Dretski. So the idea is that in a perceptual case, representing a property does not, as Dretski would say, entail the representation of other properties, like shape and color, but the representation of a property is gonna entail the representation of its determinables and determinants of the same property. Whereas in the case of beliefs, that's just not the case. So you can see that how this is a kind of neo-Dretskian in some sense, but it's in the sense that in the perceptual case, attributing a property entails the attribution of other properties. But while in the Dretski case, that's in some sense it's a horizontal entailment, which you attribute one property, shape property, that's going to entail attribution to a different kind of property, size property or color property and so on. In my case, it's a vertical entailment. So attributing a property entails the attribution of other properties, namely the determinables and determinants of that same property. Whereas in the case of beliefs, that's just not so. In the case of beliefs, there is no such entailment. So here's another worry about this account, another possible worry. And that's kind of just to say that this is a little redundant. So why assume that we're representing both the determinable and the determinants of that determinable? That just seems like representing things twice. Whereas Morrison just has to say that we have this one representation of the probability distribution. So simplicity considerations should go against my account in favor of his account. So I don't think that the simplicity is on his side. I think it's on my side. So one problem with his account in general is that, well, for him, what perceptual states do is that they represent all the possible states of affairs and attribute a probability to each of those states of affairs. That's going to be a lot of possible states of affairs, leading to all kinds of computational overdrive. Whereas for me, all that needs to be represented is the determinable, and it's most likely determinant, namely variability. I'm not sure that variability has to be represented. So there's no computational overdrive. So if you want to go with simplistic considerations, which I don't like to go with, if anything, there should be on my side and nothing else. So you could have a further worry, and it's this. So I gave you this kind of neat picture whereby the perceptual states, they fall on one side and the belief states fall on the other side. And the perceptual states representing a property is entails representing its determinants and determinants. The belief states it's not. But I was kind of assuming that in the belief states it's not. Following Kulvicki in this a little bit and Goodman. Is it really true? So if I tell you that my armchair is red, I was saying that you don't thereby, you can have a belief that my armchair is red without having a belief about the various, the more specific shade. 10 of what?
10 more minutes.
For what? So I've been talking for 35 minutes?
Exactly.
It's just just a little bit about imagery. I talk about imagery. So, so when I tell you that my armchair is red, you will probably, and I kind of I said this 20 minutes ago, you will probably find certain shade of this red more probable than the other. But what I'm trying to say is that it's not the belief itself that tells you so. When you have this belief, then you can have various kind of mental imagery, which actually visualize my armchair, and that mental imagery will attribute some more determinate property. And I have a story about why the way we should think about mental imagery and the way that represents, the way mental imagery represents properties, is the same as the way perception represents it. So again, mental imagery can also represent more or less determinate or determinable properties. So if you close your eyes and visualize the house where you grew up, and I ask you to attend to the color of the curtain in your bedroom, you can do that, right? It was probably quite determinable before. Now it's very determinate. Now I ask you to shift your attention to the shape of the sink in the bathroom. Again, you can do that. It's going to be probably very determinable before, so it's going to be much more determinate now. And you can kind of play with the determinables and determinate in mental imagery in the same way as you can do it with perception. And in the case of mental imagery as well, I want to say that representing a property, a color property, implies, just as the case in the perception, the representation of the determinables, some determinables and some determinants of that property. So mental imagery, in terms of this kind of important markers of the content about whether representing a property entails representing its determinables and determinants, is on the perception side and not on the belief side. So when you have a belief about my the color property of my armchair, then at least many of us bring in some mental imagery, but that's completely external to the belief content, and that gets you to have some kind of representation of the more determinate property of my armchair. But that's not part of the belief content. All right. That's it. That's all I got. Thanks.